Like he said, we're gonna begin in the Gospel of Matthew. Hopefully we can do some things and maybe learn some things that you haven't maybe noticed in the past. Maybe you have, but we're gonna have a lot of fun with this. I do encourage you to, if you can, take some notes. I'm gonna give you some points and that you can write down in time to do that. Uh, but before I get into this gospel, as many of you may already know, each gospel presents Christ in a certain way, right? For instance, Pastor preached on the book of John, which projects the deity of Christ. The book of Luke presents the humanity of Christ. Mark presents the servant, and Matthew presents the King. Somebody say the King. Now, one of these weeks, I'm going to bring in my Burger King crown so we have a visual, but I don't have that today. Now, one thing I want to focus on, and really I want you to understand this, and you can apply it to any time you're studying the Word, is really to understand the context of what you're reading. Because it's really simple to pick and choose a verse and make it sound or mean whatever we want it to mean. But that's not always its intentions. And I really, really encourage you when we go through this and to apply it to all of your study and all of your reading. I'll give you a brief example, and then I'll get into the background of Matthew. For example, we all know the verse Philippians 4:13, correct? I can do what? Now, I can make that verse mean whatever I want it to mean. It's really easy to do. I can make it sound great. I can apply it to any part of my life, and that's fine. But the true context of that passage, if you really study it, Paul is literally suffering in jail, and he's being encouraged by the church, the local church, and he's telling them not to worry about his suffering because he can take care of it. It doesn't mean you're getting a new boat. It means you can get through the trial. You see what I'm saying? So, as we go forward through each of these verses, I really want you to keep that in mind. Now, Matthew is presenting Christ as king. That is the overarching theme you'll notice, especially in the first 4 chapters. Once we get to the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to see it change a little bit. But the first 4 chapters, you will see the presentation of Christ as king. Now, we're going to begin in chapter 1. We're going to go to the most fun place there is to read the Bible, and that's the genealogies. Anybody ever thought to themselves, what? You know how many there are in Scripture? I believe there's 47. I have to double check my math, but there are a ton of them, and a lot of times we kind of gloss over that, but there's a reason and a purpose why they are there. And so we're going to break that down for just a little bit. So go with me to Matthew chapter 1. And so I want to introduce the subject in the book a little bit to start with. And at the time when Christ was born, Israel, as you well know, was under Roman domination. There were many things about the Roman domination or oppression that were oppressive to Israel. One aspect was the crushing taxation system. Okay, we're gonna apply a little practical information to what we know in the Bible, and we will have a good relation with it. But one aspect of the oppression of Rome was its crushing taxation system. It was a cruel system. It was relentless and very systematic. They had this very firm taxation system from all of its conquered nations. Now understand this, Israel was conquered by Rome. It wasn't the only little, I guess you would call fiefdom that existed. They had all these little pocket nations that they had conquered. And through those pocket nations, they would require taxes, okay? Now, there were 2 particular taxes that were taken. One was the poll tax, which basically would be comparable to like our income tax, for example. The other was called the ground tax, which would be kind of like property tax or land tax. And it was interesting the way this worked. You see, the Roman senators, who were very wealthy in the city of Rome, along with prominent magistrates and other people like that, they had the opportunity to buy at public auction the revenues that were brought in through this taxation, which is interesting. So each country, say for instance in Israel, when it was dominated by Rome, those who were wealthy, it could have been a senator, it could have been a wealthy business owner, but they could acquire all of the revenues that came through that taxation. In other words, there was this sort of coalition of Roman wealthy senators, and they would buy the right from the Roman government to draw taxes. And what they would do is they would hire out these men who were locals in Israel, for example. Because y'all remember, y'all ever hear tax collectors throughout the New Testament? Terrible phrase. If you were a tax collector, you were no different than a murderer. You were no different than a prostitute. You were as bad as they come. So what would happen was the tax collectors would be locals. They would be Israelites. They would be people who were from that area, who looked the part, who sounded the part, who would be paid off by these rich dignitaries. And so this is where the scheming would take place, and so they would take money off the top and begin to rob their own people. In other words, it was straight up theft is what it was. So what you have here is all these individual people working to gather taxes to give to the wealthy senators who have purchased the right to gain the revenue. That brings us to our author, Matthew. Okay? Now, Matthew was a tax collector. All right? Now, tax collectors, or you'll often hear the term publican, a lot of times in the New Testament, were ranked, again, with harlots. They were heathen. They were robbers. They didn't run in very good company. So to make things worse, around the year 33 A.D., there was this great financial crisis in Rome, and because of this, Rome exacted even the worst tax from its conquered nations, which created a worse problem. Now, go with me really quick to Matthew chapter 9. We're going to get a quick introduction to our author. Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and he followed him. Now, here's the first time we get to meet Matthew, the tax collector. He rose and he followed him. Now, it's an amazing thing in the first place that Jesus would have anything to do with a tax collector. Okay? That in and of itself was astonishing. A man who was known in his society, at least, by his job. He was hated because of what he did. And here comes Jesus, mingles with him, calls him to follow him, and this is remarkable to me. He does it without question. Now, he gets up, he follows him, gets up from the table where he was literally collecting taxes, and he follows him. Some have said, and I'm sure it's true, that only Jesus Christ could work such a transformation of turning a publican into an apostle. This is remarkable. And that is the miracle of Matthew, who became the writer of the first gospel record. Now, I want you to understand this. We have 4 gospel accounts, but there's only one gospel. Okay? There's only one gospel, but we get 4 different accounts. And the gospel is simply the good news of Jesus Christ in a singular message. But there are 4 gospels that we call gospels historically. And now we see the introduction of the first one. There is no documentation about Matthew's background up until this point. So it is believed that he himself was actually a fairly decent person as far as he wasn't scamming people. Not all of the tax collectors were bad. For some of them, it was a job. So, but they were painted in a bad light because there were those who would steal and who would, take money off the top. So it is assumed that he was a good person, and him being Jewish, he would know of the prophecies, which we'll learn later, of Christ. And so when Jesus appears on the scene, there had to be some working knowledge. That's what's believed to have been. Again, I think Matthew here, I believe he's a modest man uh, because, again, Jesus approaches. He doesn't question it. He goes right along with it. People aren't turned off by this necessarily. There's no, riot in the streets. You can't pick that guy. Of all guys, you can't pick that guy. You don't see any account of that. So he is believed to be at least a modest, decent person from his people. Now that we know a little bit about the author, we also need to know why he wrote it. It's important to know why. It's also important to know the audience to whom he was writing, and we're going to get to that. With his particular chapter, Matthew is actually addressing the Jews, and there's a reason why this genealogy is listed. And so, this gospel can be expressed in one simple statement. It is written to rehearse the story of salvation. It is to demonstrate the fact that Jesus is Christ, the predicted Messiah, the King of the Jews, who was rejected by his own people, who was accepted by the Gentiles, and someday will return to reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. It is the gospel. All right. So, this gospel is written to rehearse the story of salvation. And in that story, to demonstrate the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the predicted Messiah, the King of the Jews, who was rejected by his own people, who was accepted by the Gentiles, and who someday will return to reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is the gospel message. It is the story of the king who comes, the king who is rejected, and the king who will return. Now, I'm going to actually write those down. The king who comes, number one. The king who comes, number two. The king who is rejected, and number three, the king who will return. And I want to talk about those three major points for just a moment. First of all, Matthew deals with the king revealed, or the king who comes. The first thing you notice in Matthew's gospel is that Christ is presented as king. There's just no question about it. The person of Jesus is painted in royal colors, and you're going to see this. His ancestry line is traced. This is what we're going to read here in Matthew, is the actual royal line that goes through the father, Joseph. You also have another one of these in Luke. Anybody know the difference? It goes through Mary. Do you know why that's important? Why do we need both? Because in Matthew, in order to be considered as king, that lineage passed down through who? The father. But he didn't have a father. If you believe in a virgin birth, this can't happen. So now, if you're adopted into a Jewish family, you inherit all of the rights of the father. But you still had to be blood in order to be in the line of David, which is why we have the account in Luke. Now, let me explain it to you like this. The Jews were adamant about their genealogies. They knew. That's why this is listed. His audience is to the Jews, and he had to prove to them, line by line, where Jesus came from. So there was no doubt whatsoever. That's why it's listed. Even the ones in the Old Testament project to Christ, and everything after Christ points back. It's pretty remarkable. We see his herald, John the Baptist, in chapter 3, declares that his kingdom is at hand. Even in his temptation, you see the royalty of the person, because the temptation itself reaches a climax when he, by Satan, is offered the kingdoms of the world. And even Satan acknowledges that he has the right to rule. His miracles were his royal credentials. His parables were called the mysteries of the kingdom. He was hailed as the son of David, and he claims the freedom to pay tribute to the kings of the earth, for he himself is the child of the king. This is remarkable. And then the book of Matthew takes on another character, the king rejected. And as we study the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to see the people to whom he came, for whom he sought submission, reject him. Matthew is the gospel of rejection. You see this a lot. No other gospel has so much to say about his kingliness, and no other gospel has so much to say about his rejection as king. Now, before he was even born, his mother was in danger of being rejected by Joseph. Y'all remember that? The angel appears to Joseph. What was Joseph thinking? Hey, she stepped out on me. And the angel of the Lord had to appear before Joseph and tell him, no, that's not the case. Not the case at all. The shadow of rejection is never lifted from the Gospel of Matthew. You're going to see that. On the plains of Bethlehem, no angel choir sings, but mothers are weeping in anguish as their babies are being slaughtered. Remember when King Herod sends his soldiers to wipe out the babies? He was hurried away for his life to live 30 years in obscurity of little to no account. Outside of the little moments in the temple, you don't hear much. You don't hear much about his childhood. Why is that? We're going to get there. In no gospel do you see Christ painted in such a bitter light than you do in Matthew, from the beginning to the end. So the king is revealed and the king is rejected. But Matthew also presents the fact that the king will return, which is pretty cool. Matthew 24, we get to chapters 24 and 25. I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but you see the coming of the king and his return, which is incredible. But to begin with, let's go to chapter 1. Matthew starts by presenting the king. The king is revealed, and it begins with Jesus' family tree. Guess what? If a king is to be heralded as a king, he has to be believed to be a king. If he is to have any credibility at all, if anybody is to accept the fact that he is king, then you have to start with proof. These were very matter-of-fact people. There was a royal line in Israel that came through who? David, correct. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God said through the prophet Nathan to David that it would be through the loins of David that who? The king would come who would ultimately reign in Israel and set upon an eternal kingdom. That was never fulfilled in Solomon. He tried. So they waited for one born of a seed of David to fulfill that prophecy. And so if Jesus is to be king, it must be established that he has the right to reign. And you're going to see something pretty amazing in this. They never question this. Through the entire time that Jesus is walking in his ministry, the Israelites or the Jewish people, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and whatever seeds you want to call them, they never point to this fact. They never deny his lineage back to David. Now, what they do deny is his deity, but they never deny this, which is remarkable to me because it fulfills so many Old Testament prophecies that they themselves believe, which is remarkable. Now, that is precisely what verses 1 to 17 present. So let's look at them. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, we get to all the begats. It's always fun, but we're going to learn a little bit about it. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judah and his brethren. Judah begat Perez and Zerah of Tamar. Perez begat Hezron. Hezron begat Ram. Ram begat Abinadab. Abinadab begat Nahshon. Nahshon begat Salmon. These names will be on the quiz. Just kidding. get bonus points if you spell them right. Verse, yeah, there you go. Salmon. I remember that one. That was easy. Sounds pretty good, too. Verse 5. Salmon begat Boaz of Rahab. Everybody knows who Boaz is. Boaz begot Obed of Ruth. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David the king. And David the king begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. And Solomon begot Rehoboam. And Rehoboam begot, I forget this one, Abijah, yeah. Begot Uzzah, and Uzzah begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram. Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz. Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Ammon. Ammon begot Josiah. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers. About that time, they were carried away to Babylon. I'm gonna show you why they break this up. It's pretty interesting. They were brought to Babylon, and Jeconiah begat Shealtiel. Shealtiel begot Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel begat Abihud. Abihud begot Eliakim. Eliakim begot Azor. Azor begot Zadok. Zadok begot Achim. Achim begot Eliud. Eliud begot Eleazar. Eleazar begot Mathan. Mathan begot Jacob. And Jacob begot Joseph. Notice this. The husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, you can breathe. We got through it. We can breathe now. So, check this out. All of the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. Okay? And from David until the carrying away into Babylon, 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations. We'll stop there. That's pretty astounding. God is really good at math. And he's really good with patterns. Right on the money. Now, I'm not letting you go now. Because we have no practical information yet. So why, you may ask this question, why in the world do we have all this? Well, let me tell you why. First of all, the Jews were tenacious about their pedigree. I mean tenacious about it. They were all about their pedigree. If anybody was going to be presented to be their king, it was absolutely essential that they had the pedigree to prove it. It was always important. For example, the conquest of Canaan. You remember when they went into Canaan after Egypt, after they spent all that time in the desert? They go to Canaan, land flowing with milk and honey. God promised them when they came to Egypt, after the conquering of the land of Canaan, it was essential to determine what your tribe was and what your heritage was so that you knew where you were to live. God even divided it up into tribes then. And according to Numbers chapter 26, you had to know your tribe. You had to know your family. You had to know your father's house so that you could identify yourself with the right location in the land, or you didn't have any inheritance. This was crucial. It's not as deep. Well, I'll show you here in a moment. Another interesting indication is in Ezra chapter 2. These sought their registration among those who were reckoned by genealogy. And what it means is that when after the Babylonian captivity, when they started to go back, the people started coming back to Israel. Remember, after that 70 years in captivity, they started flowing back, and many of them were claiming to be priests. They were claiming to be in the tribe of what? Levi. That was a problem because if you falsified that information, you died. God did not like that whatsoever. And so it was important to know who you came from. In fact, it's most interesting to remember to me, and hopefully you remember this, that even when the New Testament begins, what is it that Joseph and Mary are doing? Coming back. They're going down to be registered according to their own ancestry in their own place because they're having to be identified in that manner. Luke chapter 2, the first 4 verses, it tells us simply that. came to pass in those days, they went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, Christmas story, and all the world should be registered or taxed. And the registration was first made when Quirinius, the governor of Syria, and everybody went to be registered in his own city. Joseph also went from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth to Judea, which is the city of David, because he is from the line of David. There's identifications here. It was still being used at the time of Christ's birth. And it supports his ancestral claim to the throne to be king of Israel. Remember, this is pretty remarkable, and you're going to see as we go through these chapters, Jesus is not only king of the Jews, but he will be presented to king of the world. But in chapter 1, he's king of the Jews. Now, in the New Testament, you have Paul saying something like this, Romans 11. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. And when Paul says this, for I am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of what? Benjamin. Paul's keeping up with it too. He was still laying out his own pedigree. To the Jewish people, it was important, it was crucial, and essential. This is why you see that there are, I said 47. I may have missed some because I tried to count them all, but around 50. We'll say around 50 genealogies in the Bible. And there are reasons for that. Not only the royal line, but the priestly line in the terms of property transfer and so forth. Now, it has changed a little bit. There is some knowledge of this today, but it is not nearly as well known in today's day and age. It is really difficult, even back when Israel became a state, what was it, 48, 49? 48. When they started coming back, there was some confusion as to where they belonged because they weren't sure. They didn't have it documented or written down. Now, people assume certain things, but I'm going to show you the importance of this. They don't really have an accurate account after this time of Christ. Now, watch this. They don't have much of a record of their tribal ancestry today, and they can't really trace it all that well. It is somewhat vanished in a sense. I'm sure we can get on, Ancestry.com and maybe find a few things, but it doesn't go back that far. All right? They can't really trace it that well. So, get this. No Jew existent in the world today could prove who he is. See what I'm saying? Apart from this, there is no evidence that somebody after Christ could assume the mantle of Christ because they don't have the documentation to say that I can be king of the Jews. Like, you can't say it. It had to be then, and we're going to find out the prophecies and stuff that he fulfilled later. But just this itself was proof enough that he had to be it, because after him, there was no other chance. There's no other evidence. Now, there are some Orthodox Jews who still believe the Messiah is going to come, but the problem is they'll never be able to prove it. Themselves. In fact, Orthodox Judaism still today is holding out for the Messiah to come and to reign here on this earth to deliver them as rulers of the world. That's still their ideology. If you get down into Judaism, that is what they believe. In fact, they would hold to the teachings of Moses. They would hold to the teachings of Isaiah. And they would look to certain things in this account, and they would try to disprove who Christ was because he came in such obscure manners. He was from Nazareth. Imagine being from Nazareth. It's like being from Midway. Who lives in Midway? Nobody lives out there. That's kind of the way it was. And so they don't want to admit that number one, they crucified their king. And number two, they don't believe that he could come in such obscurity because they thought that they had the right to rule. Now, as I said earlier, there are some distinctions between this genealogy and the Luke genealogy. Matthew is showing the legal, now watch this, it's the legal genealogy of Christ, the legal descent of Jesus as the King of Israel. Luke is showing the lineal or the bloodline. And you say, what's the difference? The difference is this. The royal line always was passed through which parent? The father. Always came through the father. But Jesus had no human father. So in order to have the bloodline to reign, he had to be a descendant of David through his mother as well. Covered another way. Matthew follows the royal line through David and Solomon, David's son. Matthew follows it all the way down. He gets to David, and then the royal line went through Solomon. This is pretty cool. But David had another son. He had several, but this other one was Nathan. Mary's line came through Nathan. So what you have is one line coming down through David, and it goes this way through Solomon and this way through Nathan. Now, through Nathan, you come to Mary, and through Solomon, you come to Joseph. Both of them, the seed of David, both of them passing on royal blood. So, lineally, bloodline, he is of David. Legally, as heir to the throne, he is of David, both his mother and his father. Now, go with me really quick to verse 16. We'll look at that. This is interesting. It says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. This is really interesting here. What doesn't it say? Nope, it does not. He says the husband of Mary. The Bible never calls Joseph the father of Jesus, ever. He never calls him the true father. And by the way, look at verse 16 again. Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom born Jesus, of whom, focus on that phrase there, of whom in the Greek is in the feminine gender. He was born not of Joseph, he was born of Mary. Just even in the wordplay. He was Joseph's child legally, because if you were adopted into the family, you were the legal child with all the rights and privileges. He was Mary's child lineally and by blood. And so every way possible, Jesus Christ had the right to rule. Now, it's interesting that in Luke, in his genealogy, verse 23 of chapter 3, it says, and Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli, and so forth. He was considered by everybody, now watch this, he was considered by everybody to not be the real son of Joseph. He was not the physical son of Joseph. But because of his adoption, it's okay. Now, most people thought, at least at the time of his birth, that he was the son of some illicit affair. Again, that's why at the beginning Joseph was going to leave Mary until the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph. But they called him the son of Joseph because Joseph was constituted his legal father. And there was never really any question about that. So, we have perfect fulfillment, perfect in all the sense of the word. Look at verse 11. It says, and Josiah, I want to just pull this out because I thought it was fascinating. Josiah begot Jeconiah, his brethren. Now this is really interesting to me. Sorry, I'm kind of geeking out on you, I know. But Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brethren. Now, about the time of the Babylonian captivity, when they were carried away to Babylon, and after they were brought there, watch this. Jeconiah begot Salathiel, and Salathiel begat Zerubbabel. Okay? Now, I want you to know something very interesting. We read his name, Jeconiah. Josiah begat Jeconiah, and Jeconiah begat so-and-so. Now, there's something very interesting here. I believe it's in the Gospel of Luke. Anyways, I want you to go with me real quick to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 22. I want you to see this for yourself. Jeremiah 22, verse 30. It says this, "Thus saith the Lord, write this man down as childless." And the man to whom it refers is Jeconiah, the same man, a man who shall not succeed in his days. None of his offspring shall sit on the throne of David. Did you get that? None of Jeconiah's offspring will ever sit on the throne of David. That was the curse on Jeconiah in Jeremiah 22:30. So God couldn't go back on that, yet he's in the lineage of which parent? Joseph. See how this works? It's fascinating. If Jesus had been the real son of Joseph, he never could have sat on the throne of David. He would be under the curse. And yet, he had to be the legal son of Joseph to have the right. So God had a plan which would be the legal heir to the throne. He would not be in the line of David descending through Jeconiah. Couldn't be. And so God did it by virgin birth, bypassing the actual bloodline of Jeconiah and yet carrying the royal line and right to reign through both Joseph and Mary. This is very detailed. You think God's actually got this planned out, which is remarkable to me. Because sometimes, we'll sit in church or classes and we hear things and, we know a lot of the Bible on the surface level, and then when you start digging that it is meticulously planned out by God. It has all been preordained and organized. Fascinating. Which I find it amazing that God guards every single detail. And through it, the virgin birth solves all of that. All kidding aside, I want you to understand, like when you're studying on your own, it doesn't have to be this particular passage, but anytime you're reading the Word of God, you can go so much farther. Like you think, I know that book, I know that gospel, I've read Romans 1,500 times, but there's still a wealth of information to really grasp the Word of God. And I'm just trying to paint a picture of how deep we can go. And, we can go farther than this, and we'll speed up as we go, but this is how rich the Word of God truly is. It isn't just a book. It is a living Word that is constantly reaching us and speaking to us. And so it's important for us to really dive into some of these details. And the last time I taught this, we were dealing with 20-year-olds, and by the time we get done, they have a pretty firm grasp. And I'm really encouraged in here because you're way ahead. And so let's go back to verse 1. This is again the introduction. The book of the genealogy of Christ, son of David, the son of Abraham. The book biblios here, the word biblios in Greek, it can mean a book or it can mean a list. Here it means a list of names or a record, the book of Genesis or beginnings, the book of beginnings about Jesus Christ. This is the story of how Jesus Christ came to be. This is the record of his origin, of his ancestry. I'm going to give you some Greek phrases here. Number one is Isos Christos, I-S-O-U-S, then Christ with an O-S on the end. So, Sus, S-O-U-S, is the Greek equivalent of the Old Testament Yeshua, or Yeshua, which simply means Jehovah saves. That was to be his name. Matthew 1:21, it says, "Thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he will" what? Save his people from their sins. Correct. Yeshua, Jehovah saves. Then there's Christos, which means the anointed. He was anointed as a prophet, he was anointed as a priest, and he was anointed as what? As a king. And so here you have the book about the beginnings of the one who will save, who is anointed as prophet, priest, and king. And it was so important to know this. And our dear Lord Jesus, pure and spotless without sin, was mocked, maligned, slandered, and always had innuendos thrown at him about the remarks of his origin. In the 13th chapter of Matthew, verse 54, it says, when he was come in his own country, he taught them in their synagogues, inasmuch they were astounded, and they said, from where hath this man this wisdom, these mighty works? Where did he get this ability? They asked the question, is this the carpenter's son? In other words, please, they're speaking sarcastically here. Like, I know Joseph, and he ain't that smart. That's how they're thinking. Is not his mother Mary? We know Mary. I saw her at the grocery store. Piggly Wiggly, we'll call it that. His brethren, he had physical, real brothers, half-brothers and sisters, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and his sisters. For where hath this man all these things? And they were offended. He doesn't have any right to this kind of stuff. Who is he? He comes out of a lowly bunch up in Nazareth, the rednecks. That's what it was. Let's just call it that. Yeah. In the 7th chapter of John, again, this kind of mockery about his origin. Jesus comes down to the Feast of Tabernacles. The Jews get upset at him because of what he says. He says this, nevertheless, we know this man from where he is. But when Christ comes, no man knows where he's from. Listen, we know this Jesus. I mean, this is not the Christ. We know where he comes from. He's a hayseed. Again, redneck. He's a hayseed from Nazareth up the hill. You can't believe this is the Messiah. Nothing good comes from Nazareth. You said it. So Matthew, you see, looks back on all this, and under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he writes down the book of the beginnings of Jesus Christ. So there never needs to be a question about where he came from, ever. Now, there's an emphasis in this genealogy that I want to speak to for just a moment before we're done. And it just thrills me. It's woven into this thing in a way. When I was studying this, it's like, Lord, what are you saying here? How do I say anything about this? And I began to think about the fact that Jesus was the king. He wasn't a king like any other king. He wasn't a king who ruled by law. He wasn't a king who ruled by anything, but by grace. And I tried to search. I tried to see through this genealogy and how could it tie into this. And I began to look and look everywhere I could. And I found some interesting things. There's grace everywhere. We're going to break down this list of names, and some of it's going to thrill you. It's all over the place. His grace is everywhere. He is king, but most kings rule with an iron fist. And most kings rule by law. Most kings don't know anything about grace, but this one does. And I see it in 4 things. First of all, I see a king of grace in the choice of one woman, the choice of the first thing that just hit me when I was reading verse 16 says, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, who was born Jesus, who is called Christ. And I thought to myself, there's grace right there. You imagine that lady? Some say she was just a teenager at the time. But grace on that one lady, that one little girl, Mary, became the mother of the Messiah, the mother of the Son of God. Nobody knew about Mary before this. And I don't want to shake you up too much, but I'm going to tell you a little bit something here. Mary was a sinner. Because the Catholic Church believes she wasn't. That's why. Mary was a sinner. Well, the Bible tells us that. She was like everybody else. She was like all the other men, the other women. And I don't mean she was worse than anybody else. She was probably better than most. And she was probably a deeply devout and religious person. But nevertheless, she was a sinner who needed a Savior. And Christ came to save her as well. And yet God, in his wonderful, mysterious grace, chose her. He didn't have to do that, but he did. Now, I want to kind of sidetrack just a little bit so you understand why this is important. The Roman Catholic Church has elevated Mary to a place of incredible loftiness. And I'm sure Mary, if she knew about it, she would be very upset. But they say that Mary is sinless. Mary maintained perpetual virginity, which is hard since the people recited all the names of her children. They say that Mary is co-redemptrix with Christ. In other words, she is his equivalent in saving us. She is the co-mediatrix. In other words, she is co-mediator with Christ to the Father, which this is all straight up heresy. And that she also bodily assumed into heaven and never died because she was sinless. Therefore, she wouldn't die. And that is the farthest thing from the truth, because we even see Jesus himself approaching John saying, when I'm gone, please take care of my mother. And so Jesus, and I'm going to show you this, Jesus actually minimizes the place of Mary. In other words, in Mark chapter 3, verse 31, it says, there came then his brothers and his mother standing outside, sent to him, calling him, and Jesus was inside teaching. And the multitude sat about them, and they said unto him, behold, thy mother and thy brother are outside looking for you. Imagine that. Jesus is teaching. They come in and say, hey, your mama's outside. She needs you. He answered them, saying, who is my mother and my brethren? And he looked around and said, behold, my mother, my brethren. In other words, you're my mother, you're my brethren, whosoever shall do the will of God. Jesus is basically saying, don't worry about that right now. I am going about my Father's business. In other words, I'll get to you later. So he's minimizing the place of Mary here. In other words, she's just another face in the crowd. Jesus understood this. Again, this is carefully laid out by God, because he knew what would come down the line. He knew that the largest religious group existing in the world today would be the Roman Catholic Church, teaching this heresy throughout the world. It has been for the last 1,500 years or so. Let's move on. So we see the gospel of grace in the choice of this woman. We also see it in the seed of two men. Look at verse 1. This is fabulous. Verse 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. And the second one, the son of Abraham. Let me ask you this question. Was David a sinner? Absolutely. Absolutely. Was Abraham a sinner? Yeah, I've got it. David was also a sinner. Abraham was also a sinner.